What history books left out about the rise of civilization isn't a battle, it isn't a king, it isn't even an idea, it's a fungus. Specifically, it's a single-celled organism so small that 10 million of them could fit inside the period at the end of this sentence. An organism with no brain, no agenda, no awareness of what it was doing to the species it hitched a ride with, and yet, without it, the cities don't get built, the armies don't march, the religions don't organize, the writing systems don't develop, because the administrative complexity that made writing necessary in the first place never materializes. The truth about how civilization actually formed is uncomfortable for a particular reason. It suggests we weren't as much in control of our own ascent as we'd like to believe. Yeast didn't follow humanity into history. Humanity followed yeast. Now here's the pushback I'd expect at this point. That's an overstatement. Humans domesticated yeast the same way they domesticated wheat or cattle. They were always in the driver's seat. That argument sounds reasonable. It's also wrong. And the reason it's wrong tells you something important about how we construct historical narratives in the first place, which is what this video is actually about. Before going further, something worth stating plainly, the conventional history of early civilization is told through the lens of human decision-making. Humans chose to settle, humans chose to farm, humans chose to store grain. In this version, fermentation is a clever discovery, a technique humans developed and refined. The microbe is a tool, the human is the craftsman. That framing has dominated historiography for so long that it feels like fact. It isn't. The evidence, and there's quite a lot of it, running across multiple archaeological sites, across disciplines that don't usually talk to each other, across chemical analyses of pottery shards that sat in museum storage for decades before anyone thought to test them, points somewhere else entirely. It points to a story where yeast was active, widespread, and already shaping human behavior before humans had any concept of what yeast was. That's the argument this video is making. Not that humans were passive, not that yeast was conscious, but that the relationship between Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Homo sapiens is better understood as a co-evolutionary partnership, one in which the microbe's interests and the human's interests aligned so completely for so long that civilization emerged from the overlap. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. It sits in what is now southeastern Turkey, and it's been upending assumptions about early human society since excavations began in the 1990s. The structures there are monumental. Carved stone pillars arranged in circles, decorated with animals, built with a coordination that implies organized labor, surplus resources, and some form of social hierarchy. And they date to approximately 11,500 years ago. That is older than the earliest evidence of agriculture, which means people were organizing complex collective labor before they were farming. The question that haunted archaeologists for years: what were they eating? What was sustaining the population required to build this? And more pressingly, what were they drinking? The answer came partly from residue analysis of stone vessels found at the site and at related sites across the region. The vessels contained traces of oxalate, a compound produced when grain is fermented. The evidence suggests that large-scale fermentation of grain into early beer predates, or at minimum accompanies, the domestication of grain for food. Sit with that for a moment. The first large-scale use of grain by humans may not have been bread. It may have been beer. And if that's true, if fermentation was the original motivation for grain cultivation rather than a downstream discovery, then the entire story of the agricultural revolution needs to be re-examined. Because it means yeast wasn't domesticated after farming began. Yeast, in a very real sense, may have been the reason farming began at all. This is not fringe archaeology. The hypothesis was developed and documented rigorously by scholars including Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, whose chemical analysis of ancient fermented beverages across multiple archaeological sites has produced some of the most important evidence in the field. McGovern's work suggests that the drive to produce fermented grain beverages was a significant, possibly primary, motivating factor in the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer life to settled agricultural communities. Yeast didn't just ride the agricultural revolution. There's a serious case to be made that yeast caused it. Move forward several thousand years to Mesopotamia, the river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the first cities emerged: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, the places that gave the world writing, law, organized religion, and the first bureaucracies complex enough to need all three simultaneously. The economy of these cities ran on two things: grain and labor. Grain was currency. Grain was taxation. Grain was stored in temple complexes and redistributed through administrative systems detailed enough to require the invention of cuneiform script to track. And a substantial portion of that grain was fermented. Sumerian administrative tablets, some of the oldest written documents in human history, record rations of beer distributed to workers, not as a luxury, as a caloric and nutritional staple. The workers building the ziggurats, maintaining the irrigation canals, hauling the materials that made urban life possible, they were paid partly in fermented grain. Beer in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't what it became in later centuries. It was thick, nutritious, produced through a process that, while the Sumerians had no word for it, was microbial fermentation. Saccharomyces cerevisiae was converting sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide, producing a beverage that was calorie-dense, safer than standing water because the fermentation process acidified it and made it hostile to pathogens, and physiologically satisfying in ways that made sustained labor more manageable. The Sumerians had a goddess of beer. Her name was Ninkasi. There is a hymn to her, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, that doubles as a recipe. One of the oldest written recipes in human history is a set of instructions for brewing beer. Not for a king, not for a religious ceremony, though those existed too. For workers. Here's what the textbook version of this story does. It credits the Sumerian administrators for the organizational genius that built these cities. It credits the engineers for the irrigation systems. It credits the scribes for the writing. It never credits the yeast. But without the yeast, without the fermentation process that made grain safe, calorie-dense, and motivating to produce and consume, the economic infrastructure of the ancient Near East looks completely different. The ration system breaks. The labor force is harder to sustain and harder to keep. The surplus that makes administration necessary and possible is reduced. Yeast wasn't a feature of Mesopotamian civilization. It was load-bearing. Egypt added something that Mesopotamia had not fully developed: leavened bread at scale. At some point, archaeological evidence suggests no later than 4,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier, someone in the Nile region noticed that dough left to sit became different. It rose, it changed texture. Baked, it was lighter, more digestible, more palatable. The mechanism was invisible to them. There was no framework in which to understand that wild Saccharomyces cerevisiae from the air, or from the grain itself, was metabolizing sugars and producing carbon dioxide that got trapped in the gluten network of the dough. But the result was reproducible, and reproducibility was enough. Egyptian bakers developed techniques for maintaining active starter cultures, what we now call sourdough starter, that kept a viable yeast population alive across multiple batches. They were managing a living biological system with enough sophistication to produce consistent results at industrial volumes, without any understanding of what that biological system was. The bakeries attached to Egyptian temple complexes were not artisan operations, they were production facilities. Archaeologists have excavated bakeries adjacent to pyramid construction sites at Giza that show evidence of producing thousands of loaves per day. The workforce building the great monuments of the ancient world was fed, in substantial part, on leavened bread. Yeast held up the pyramids. Now, the obvious counter-argument, and it's worth steel-manning before dismantling it, is that the humans doing this work were sophisticated enough to replicate and refine the process, which means human ingenuity deserves the credit. The yeast was just chemistry. The baker was the craftsman. Here is the problem with that argument. The baker had no idea what they were cultivating. The starter culture they maintained, the living yeast colony they fed flour and water to keep active across weeks and months and years, was, from their perspective, a magical property of the dough. The Egyptian understanding of fermentation was theological before it was technical. The rising of bread was a gift, a transformation, a mystery that the gods had placed inside certain materials. The yeast was operating completely outside human understanding for the entirety of this period. Human ingenuity refined the process. But human ingenuity didn't design it, didn't understand it, and couldn't explain it. For several thousand years, one of the foundational technologies of human civilization was running entirely on microbial intelligence that no human knew existed. That is not a minor footnote. That is the story. Right now, wherever you are, whatever you thought this video was going to be about, the thing worth sitting with is this. Every major ancient civilization had fermentation at its economic core, and none of them knew why it worked. Every empire, every grain-based economy, every population center that grew large enough to require the organizational sophistication that produced writing, law, religion, and architecture, all of it running on a process that was invisible to everyone participating in it. If you're the kind of person who finds that detail more interesting than the kings and the battles, this channel is not for people who want history made comfortable, it's for people who want the version where the mechanism is named. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE produced, among its many consequences, a fragmentation of agricultural infrastructure, trade networks, and urban water management. Clean water, never guaranteed even at the height of Roman engineering, became increasingly unreliable across large parts of Western Europe. Into that gap, fermented grain beverages stepped as functional necessity. Ale, produced from malted grain, water, and wild yeast without hops until the later medieval period, was not primarily an intoxicant in early medieval Europe, it was a caloric supplement. It was a safer alternative to water of uncertain provenance, because fermentation acidified the liquid and killed or suppressed many of the pathogens that made standing water dangerous. It was produced in monasteries, in farmhouses, in village operations across a continent where nutritional precarity was the baseline condition for most of the population. The monasteries deserve specific attention here. Benedictine monastic communities across Western Europe were, from approximately the 6th century through the high medieval period, among the most sophisticated agricultural and fermentation operations on the continent. The monks weren't brewing as a sideline. Fermentation, of grain into ale, of grape into wine, of grain into bread, was central to the monastic economy, to the monastery's ability to sustain itself, to feed its community, to produce surplus for trade, and to maintain the scriptoriums and libraries and teaching functions that made monasteries the primary repositories of learning during the period. The preservation of classical knowledge through the medieval period, the copying of manuscripts, the maintenance of Latin literacy, the continuation of mathematical and philosophical traditions that would eventually feed into the Renaissance, happened in institutions that were economically grounded in fermentation. The monks who copied Aristotle were sustained by yeast. This is not a romantic overstatement. It is a supply chain observation. Remove fermentation from the monastic economy and the material conditions that made sustained intellectual work possible. The caloric sufficiency, the economic surplus, the institutional stability become significantly harder to maintain. The Enlightenment has parents, and some of them are microbial. September 1857. Louis Pasteur, a French chemist who had spent several years investigating the problem of why batches of beet sugar fermenting into alcohol would sometimes go wrong, turning sour rather than alcoholic, publishes a paper in the Memoirs de la Société des Sciences de Lille titled, in translation, Report on the Lactic Acid Fermentation. In it, he argues something that is, at the time, genuinely controversial. Fermentation is not a chemical process. It is a biological one. It is produced by living microorganisms. The implications of this take a moment to land. For the entirety of human history up to that point, for the 10,000 years or more during which human civilization had been built on fermentation, nobody knew what was doing it. Pasteur named yeast as a living organism in 1857. The Sumerians had been running their economy on it for 7,000 years by then. The Egyptians had been feeding their pyramid workers on it for 4,000 years. The medieval monks had been sustaining their scriptoriums on it for over 1,000 years. Every civilization, every empire, every grain-based economy that produced everything else we call human achievement, running on a process that remained scientifically unnamed and biologically unexplained until less than 200 years ago. Pasteur's discovery did not slow fermentation down, it accelerated it. Once you know what the organism is, you can isolate it, cultivate it, select for specific strains, optimize its behavior for specific applications. The industrial yeast industry that emerged from the late 19th century onward produced fermentation at a scale that made everything before it look artisanal. By the 20th century, yeast wasn't just making bread and beer, it was making antibiotics, insulin, vaccines, biofuels, industrial chemicals. The same organism that a Sumerian administrator issued to workers as a beer ration was being engineered to produce pharmaceuticals. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is now one of the most studied organisms on Earth. It was the first eukaryote, any organism whose cells contain a nucleus, to have its entire genome sequenced in 1996. It is used as a model organism in genetics, in cancer research, in the study of aging. The things being learned about human cellular biology through the study of yeast are considerable and ongoing. The microbe didn't stop building civilization when we finally noticed it. It just started building different things. The contemporary yeast industry is worth pausing on because it makes visible something that the ancient world kept invisible by default. There are companies whose entire business model is the cultivation, optimization, and sale of specific yeast strains. The global yeast market is measured in billions of dollars annually. Industrial fermentation, driven largely by engineered or selected yeast strains, underlies production in pharmaceuticals, food manufacturing, biofuel, and materials science. This is not a footnote to the biotech industry. Yeast-driven fermentation is, by volume and by economic value, one of the largest biological manufacturing processes on Earth. And here is the thing that should make anyone who studies history uncomfortable. We are in a period of yeast's influence that may be more consequential than anything that came before it, and the general public has roughly the same level of awareness of that fact as a Sumerian grain administrator had of what was happening inside his beer. The mechanisms have been named. The genome has been sequenced, the organism is understood at a level the ancient world could not have approached, and still, the vast majority of people consuming products derived from yeast-based fermentation have no model of what yeast is, what it does, or how comprehensively it continues to underwrite the material conditions of their daily life. The pattern hasn't changed, only the scale has. Someone who has spent time inside the industrial fermentation industry, not a dissident, someone who spent decades working in yeast strain development for a major agricultural biotech firm, described it this way, speaking carefully about the gap between what the industry understands and what the public understands. The relationship between yeast and human civilization has always been characterized by humans getting enormous benefit from a process they don't understand, and then being surprised when someone finally explains it to them. That pattern, he said, has not ended. We've moved the line of what gets explained. But there's still a line, and there's still a lot on the other side of it. That is a remarkable thing for someone inside the machine to say. Here is the thing that historians rarely state plainly, because stating it plainly is uncomfortable. The standard history of civilization is a story about human agency, about what humans decided, built, discovered, and controlled. That story is not false, but it is systematically incomplete in a specific way. It excludes the non-human actors that made human decisions possible in the first place. Yeast is the most significant example, but it isn't the only one. The entire history of human civilization is also a history of the microbial ecosystems that humans carried with them, traded with each other, and accidentally engineered, without knowing that any of that was happening. Every time a new civilization rose, it rose on fermented grain. Every time a new economic system organized human labor at scale, fermented grain was part of the payment structure. Every time a new institution, a temple complex, a monastery, an empire's army, needed to sustain a large population in one place for a long time, fermented grain solved the logistical problem that made it possible. And Saccharomyces cerevisiae, a single-celled fungus with no brain, no agenda, no awareness, received none of the credit. The winner's history problem says, we only tell the stories of the actors we recognize as actors. For 10,000 years, we didn't recognize yeast as an actor at all. The question that this raises, and it's one this video cannot fully answer, is whether we're making the same category error right now, with other systems, other organisms, other processes operating at scales and timescales we haven't yet learned to read. Every empire that ever rose did it on fermented grain. None of them knew what was doing the fermenting. If that thought doesn't leave you slightly unsettled, you haven't fully landed it yet. The share button is right there. There's probably someone specific you're thinking of, the person in your life who talks about history in terms of kings and battles and great men making great decisions. This video is for them. The next video on this channel goes somewhere this one couldn't, into the specific moment when industrial yeast diverged from its wild ancestor and what was lost in that divergence that nobody in the fermentation industry likes to talk about. That's a different story. It has a different villain, and it's worth watching. What history got wrong about civilization isn't that humans weren't ingenious, it's that we gave ourselves all the credit. Drop in the comments what's the most significant thing you thought was a human achievement that this video just made more complicated. I want to know where this lands for you, and whether you think the argument holds, or whether you think there's a version of it I haven't accounted for. Now here's the thing I've been sitting with since finishing the research for this. If yeast shaped the conditions that made complex civilization possible, the surplus, the caloric infrastructure, the economic systems organized around fermentation, and if it did that for 10,000 years without human awareness or acknowledgement, what does that suggest about the nature of progress itself? Is progress something humans generate, or is it something that happens to humans through processes we benefit from but don't control, and that we subsequently take credit for once the outcomes are visible? I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure one exists.